So today what we are going to cover is transfusion and all that we need to know as far as people who are involved in the process of transfusion are concerned. That is the doctors and the nurses who are directly involved with the actual process of transfusion. So whenever we start a lecture, it is always good to have a background. It's always good to have a background so that we know why we are going ahead and listening to this lecture, which may be which may seem quite boring otherwise. So with this background, what we need to understand is that the transfusion in blood and blood components, it has been mentioned that it involves more than 70 steps, and each of these steps is prone to error. So that itself gives us an insight into the gravity of the situation. So if we are not well aware and conscious during each of these steps, we are actually setting up the stage for a major disaster as far as patient care is concerned. That is why this area needs well standardized protocols and a quality management system which should be in place as far as transfusion safety is concerned. Things that we should always remember as far as transfusion is concerned is that transfusion should not be ordered just on the basis of a lab value. A lab value alone should never be the criteria for assessing a transfusion requirement. The coexisting clinical conditions should also give us clues whether the patient actually requires transfusion or not. Why do we need to do this? Because the more and more literature is in support of restrictive transfusion protocols. We should not be using transfusion as and when we feel like. It should be more of a restrictive protocol. That is because irrespective of no matter whatever test that we conduct on the collected blood, there is always some inherent risk associated with transfusion. We are also involved with giving drugs, right? So we know that any drug may induce some untoward result in the patient which we cannot predict. So is the case with transfusion. In fact, the risk is much more because we are collecting it from humans. So there are limitations as far as testing goes. So there are inherent risks. Also, we should remember that the entire process of transfusion in today's time and world should be recorded. It should be recorded and it should be clear and complete. Every aspect of transfusion must be properly recorded and it should be monitored. It goes without saying that the entire process of transfusion should be monitored properly by a doctor or a nurse in order to be, in order to take necessary action if in case any transfusion reaction occurs. So we'll start with the basics, that is understanding blood components. What is blood components, and each of the component will be discussed hereafter. So what is the difference between blood component and plasma derivative? Many a times I get phone calls from the ward saying that we need albumin for the patient or coagulation factor concentrates like prothrombin complex concentrates or immunoglobulins. So these are plasma derivatives. These are not blood components. So this is what we need to keep in mind. Plasma proteins such as albumins, immunoglobulins and coagulation factor concentrates are plasma protein derivative. They are plasma derivatives and they are not available in the blood bank. What is actually available in the blood bank are the components that we prepare from blood. So what are the components that are available? Red cell concentrate, fresh frozen plasma, platelet concentrate and cryoprecipitate. These are the components that we prepare in our blood bank, and I will be discussing in detail with respect to each of the component. Where are they ordered for, what is the optimum storage temperature, etc. So these are the headings under which I will be discussing each of the components. Their description, that means what exactly is that component, what is the infection risk associated with that component, what is the storage conditions under which that component is kept. Understanding all this will help us in making transfusion, ensuring transfusion safety and that the patient benefits the maximum from the transfusion of each product. So understanding this is extremely crucial. So we begin with whole blood. Whole blood is more and more it is an outdated concept. So, but still there is a school of thought that whole blood is like you know, it's analogous to a broad spectrum antibiotic as far as the transfusion world is concerned, but that is not the case. We need to understand this properly so that we can phase out the use of whole blood and move more and more towards component transfusion. So there is a group which believes that maybe whole blood is better as far as trauma or massive hemorrhage is concerned. But the understanding of the concept of acute coagulopathy of trauma, which has been described time and again in literature, has made it quite clear that in case of trauma and massive hemorrhage, there is coexisting coagulopathy where merely transfusing whole blood would not suffice. We need to correct the coagulopathy which is existing, which is an important independent marker of morbidity as well as mortality in the patient ultimately. So that coagulopathy needs to be taken care of. So whole blood would not be the solution for that. In fact, there we would require fresh frozen plasma, which is well equipped in correcting the coagulopathy as opposed to whole blood. Another concept which we should be aware of is O whole blood universal? We have you know, in medical school time and again we are like, you know, we keep thinking along the lines that O whole blood means it's universal, we can just take and transfuse. What we need to understand right now at this level where you know, we are moving more and more towards better safety is that O whole blood is not in the strictest sense universal. This is because the O whole blood plasma will contain anti-A and anti-B antibodies. So when you are going across the group and transfusing such a whole blood, there will be a subset of O blood group donors who will have very high titers of these antibodies, anti-A and anti-B, which is normally not very high. But in some subset of the donors, these antibodies will be very high and are very well capable of causing severe hemolytic transfusion reaction in the recipient. That's why the concept that O whole blood is universal is also outdated. Next, the problems which are associated with the transfusion of whole blood, thinking that it will be a solution to all our problems, is that the platelet efficacy at this cold storage temperature is lost, because whole blood is stored at 4 degrees and platelets have a different storage temperature. So at that storage temperature, the efficacy of the platelets is completely lost. And there is a higher risk of hemolytic transfusion reaction, as I already explained in the previous slide. Then there is logistical challenges as far as whole blood is concerned. That is because everybody is now you know, interested in giving components rather than whole blood. So when a subset of clinicians believe that whole blood is to be given, there arises the logistic challenge of how to maintain the inventory of whole blood. And one more issue is hypocalcemia, which is exacerbated by transfusion of blood products. So we will start with whole blood. What exactly is whole blood? As the name itself suggests, we just collect the blood and it is not subject to any further separation. It is completely kept as it is. But of course, as we know, as we are collecting it, it has to be anticoagulated. So the anticoagulant is present in a ratio of 14 ml for every 100 ml of blood that is collected. And what is the infection risk for whole blood? Transfusion transmitted infections. So we do test for HIV, HBsAg, HCV, malaria and syphilis, but we all know that no matter what the level of you know, testing might be, there is always some you know, residual risk, because the window period is never zero, no matter what the test that we are doing. What we need to be aware of is that in our blood bank, what we do is chemiluminescence. We don't do NAT testing, nucleic acid testing, which is currently the best test which is available. So we do something which is just below the NAT testing, that is chemiluminescence. So despite whatever we do, there is still an inherent risk of transfusion transmissible infections. And of course, bacterial contamination, which is not that commonly seen with whole blood and red cell concentrates, but still there is a risk. Like if while collecting the blood, the site of collection was not properly disinfected, or there is some problem with the lot of blood bag, that is there is some common you know, bacterial contamination of the lot of blood bag, which is unusual, then you can expect a bacterial contamination related reaction in the patient. And the optimal storage of whole blood is 2 to 6 degrees Celsius. This is very important. Why do we need to understand this? Because all the red cell components are stored at this temperature, that is 2 to 6 degrees Celsius. So freezing blood and subjecting it to higher temperatures like beyond 37 is not recommended at all, and that is something that we should not attempt at the bedside. So the optimal storage temperature is 2 to 6 degrees, and this has to be done in a properly calibrated refrigerator, blood bank refrigerator, where we are continuously monitoring any variations in the temperature. So this is not to be attempted at the bedside or in the ward refrigerator. So that is something that we should totally not do. What exactly is the indication for whole blood? Acute blood loss, like I said, it is it's slowly getting outdated. Hypovolemia, hemorrhage, exchange transfusion also. In today's time, it is better to reconstitute, that is red cell concentrate and AB FFP is reconstituted and used. That is what is being done currently. So again, these two indications, though I have mentioned it, is being they have better options. Is there any contraindication as far as whole blood is concerned? There is the risk of volume overload. When you are giving whole blood to an anemic patient, you are actually doing more harm than good, because you are additionally burdening the patient with useless plasma, which will not help in the patient clinically in any way, but would actually add to the volume and especially in anemic patients with an incipient heart failure and all. This could be really a problem. How do we administer whole blood? Whole blood and red cell components, you should understand that ABO and RH compatibility is very essential. So it should be ABO and RH compatible. We already discussed that O is not O whole blood especially is not a universal donor. So with all these concepts, except in case of an emergency, you should stick to this, that the ABO and RH system must be honored. That is, it should be the component and the patient should match as far as ABO and RH system is concerned for all red cell containing products. And never add medication to a unit of blood. This goes for any component transfusion rather. Why and all the logic behind it we'll discuss as we go ahead. And one more important thing is, all the red cell components, the transfusion should end within 4 hours of commencement. So talking about red cell concentrates is an improvement on the whole blood concept, where we do away, description is that it is mostly comprised of red cells, from where most of the plasma has been removed. It is more of red cells and the plasma maximum has been removed. Only the little amount of plasma which is required to maintain the viability of red cells is left behind. The rest of the plasma has been removed. So that is the advantage as far as red cell concentrate is concerned, because we avoid the additional volume burden in an anemic patient. All the other things are same as far as red cell and whole blood is concerned. That is, the infection risk is the same. Obviously, the same risk of transfusion transmissible infections is present in red cells as for whole blood. And storage is also the same. It is stored at 2 to 6 degrees Celsius. And in a proper blood bank refrigerator, where everything is controlled and we are monitoring it continuously. So again, we should not try to store it in a freezer or try to heat it by putting it in boiling water. So all this is not recommended. We all know the indication for red cell concentrate is obvious, that in an anemic patient we order for red cell concentrate. So as far as red cell concentrate transfusion goes, is there a magic number? Is there a cutoff? That is what we are all bothered about. So if the hemoglobin is say this number, so can we say for sure that this person definitely requires transfusion or not? So honestly speaking, like we already discussed, transfusion cannot have such a magic number. But it is said that when you are evaluating and assessing a patient for transfusion of red cell concentrate, you should see if the patient is anemic and how is he or she doing hemodynamically. What is the hemodynamic condition? Then in addition to that, coexisting comorbidities, coronary syndrome, sepsis, neurological injury, all this will play with the target hemoglobin also, as well as the trigger, the hemoglobin trigger at which you should start transfusion. So in the coming slides I have just mentioned the different conditions where what should be the trigger and what should be our target hemoglobin. So the general understanding is that for a normal patient who is hemodynamically well and who has developed chronic anemia, he is generally well compensated, and you can wait till the hemoglobin level goes up to 7 gram per deciliter. You can wait till that before you initiate transfusion. So you can be confident, no other comorbidities, the patient is relatively young, less than 55 years of age, and the severity of illness is also low. You can definitely wait till the hemoglobin is 7 gram. But if the patient is elderly, has many comorbidities, you suspect there is some issue as far as the there is some condition which can compromise in the oxygenation of the tissue, then you should not wait as far as as low as 7 gram per deciliter. So these are the slides. The first one is sepsis, where they have said what should be your target. Neurocritical care, traumatic brain injury and or cerebral ischemia, the target should be more than 9. You should target it to be more than 9. Subarachnoid hemorrhage, more than 8 to 10. Ischemic heart disease, again we are always worried because here we are concerned about the oxygenation of the tissues. So in acute coronary syndrome, your target should be greater than 8 to 9, and patients who have stable angina, the target should be anywhere more than 7. So through these slides what we can understand is that it is more of a restrictive than an easily giving transfusion is no longer recommended. The transfusion protocol should be a bit more restrictive, keeping in mind what are the comorbidities which are coexisting and how can we bring about a balance as far as avoiding transfusion is concerned and giving transfusion to the patient is concerned. Next, what we will be discussing is about platelet concentrates. So there is a huge confusion in our hospital, especially with regards to platelet concentrates. So the most important concepts I will be walking you through. So platelet concentrates we know is prepared from whole blood. They can also be collected by apheresis. So there is two terminologies as far as platelet concentrates is concerned. RDP and SDP. RDP means random donor platelets and SDP means single donor platelets. What we have in our blood bank is RDP, random donor platelets. We do get requests for SDP. SDP is collected by apheresis and that is not currently available in our blood bank. So what is the description of a platelet concentrate? RDP, 50 to 60 ml of plasma it has, into which is suspended the platelets. The platelets are in a concentrated form and they are suspended in around 50 to 60 ml of plasma. So we need to know that this contains plasma mainly and platelets. Okay, red cells are generally absent as far as platelet concentrates are concerned, but during the process of while you are making platelet concentrates, sometimes there can be red cell contamination. So we should be aware of that. Normal platelet concentrate will be straw colored. It will be straw colored, but if there is gross red cell contamination, it will start looking like cloudy red, and that is where you should be concerned. Why? We will be discussing. So the normal as far as the dosage of platelets is concerned, 4 to 6 RDPs is the dose for an adult. For an adult, the dose of platelet concentrate RDP is 4 to 6 RDP. And what about the ABO group? The ABO group need not be similar as far as platelet concentrates are concerned, because the ABO antigens are almost exclusively expressed on red cells. But yeah, there are studies which say that platelets also express, but they are more of adsorbed antigens and they are not present in very high amounts. So unless the patient is a patient who has hematological conditions where he will require repeated platelet transfusion, a one-off platelet transfusion need not be ABO compatible. You can go across the group and give as far as platelet concentrates is concerned. What are the infection risks? It remains the same as for every platelet, every blood components. But what is important about platelet concentrates is there is an increased risk of bacterial contamination. and that is because the platelets are stored at 22 to 24 degrees. So I have already mentioned about the storage temperature of red cells, which was 4 to 6. As opposed to that, the platelet concentrates are stored at 22 to 24, and this is done under continuous agitation. So this is also something that as clinicians or as nurses we should be aware, that 22 to 24, and that too under continuous agitation, because if you do not agitate the platelets, they tend to clump, and you do not want to transfuse clumped platelets. So this is the storage condition. So the temperature of storage is such that it encourages bacterial proliferation. So there is always the risk of bacterial contamination with platelets. How do we decide whether the patient needs platelet transfusion? Again, there is lots of confusion. There are two types of transfusion as far as platelet goes. One is prophylactic and one is therapeutic. Prophylactic platelet transfusion means where the platelet count, you do a routine count just before doing a surgery or a lumbar puncture or some such procedure where you anticipate a bleeding risk, and there you are doing a count and you see that it is below a certain level and you want to bring it up. That is prophylactic. And the other is therapeutic, where the patient is frankly bleeding and you know it's a mucocutaneous bleed and it is because of thrombocytopenia, and there you want to give it therapeutically. So for prophylactic transfusions, the general rule is for major surgeries or invasive procedures such as epidural anesthesia, liver biopsy or lumbar puncture, maintaining the platelet count somewhere around 50,000 suffices. But for closed space surgeries such as ocular surgeries or neurosurgeries, you should bring it up to 1 lakh. The most controversial threshold as far as prophylactic platelet transfusion is for someone who seems stable but the platelet count is between 5,000 and 10,000. So here there is a whole lot of confusion, conflicting data will be seen as far as even the journals are concerned. The various factors have to be taken into consideration, like is the patient in-house, like inpatient, or is he being discharged, and then accordingly you should take a call as far as the group between 5,000 to 10,000 is concerned. And more importantly, what are the coexisting condition in the patient? So even at a higher platelet count, the patient will have a risk of bleeding if he has these problems. Coexisting, like fever, sepsis, he is taking drugs like amphotericin B, or you feel that it has started becoming symptomatic. There is major headache, neurological deficits. So you worry it is because of the dipping platelet count. There you should not withhold platelet transfusion. However, there are certain conditions where it is better to avoid platelet transfusion. You cannot strictly call it as a contraindication, but I would say that it is inappropriate. Inappropriate platelet transfusions, the conditions are TTP, thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura, heparin-induced thrombocytopenia, ITP. All these conditions, unless there is life-threatening hemorrhage, it is always better to avoid platelet transfusion. And even post-transfusion purpura. Next we are going to discuss about fresh frozen plasma, describing about it. So as the name suggests, it's kept in a frozen state. It is separated from whole blood. The plasma is taken and immediately frozen into -80 degrees Celsius and then stored at -40 or lower. And there are time limits to this procedure, like within 6 to 8 hours of collection you should start the separation of plasma and immediately freeze it. This is because you want to preserve the activity of the labile coagulation factors which may be present in the FFP. So you don't want to compromise on the quality of these coagulation factors, and hence it is kept in a frozen state. And understanding of this is helpful because when we order for fresh frozen plasma, we expect that it will be given to us immediately, which is not possible because it is in a frozen state. And another thing that we should know is, once the frozen plasma has been taken and thawed under controlled conditions, again it cannot be refrozen. That is not allowed. So these things we should know before we start out ordering for fresh frozen plasma. And audits have shown that fresh frozen plasma is in fact the most abused blood product. We use it randomly without a proper understanding of its indication. So we have to be careful when we are ordering for fresh frozen plasma, it should be properly planned. We should know that there will be a time lapse because it needs to be thawed and then only it will be given to us, and it cannot be given back because it cannot be refrozen and issued to another patient. So infection risk as far as FFP goes is the same, TTI, like I already mentioned. And one more thing is there is a misconception that because it is frozen, obviously there will be no bacterial contamination. However, this thawing is taking place in a thaw bath. So this is being done in water. It is done in a controlled way, but sometimes there is a risk that some amount of water may seep into the product and it may cause bacterial contamination. So this should be at the back of our mind, because when we are transfusing FFP and the patient develops fever, this should ring a bell in our mind. So what are the indications for fresh frozen plasma? Today these are modern times where we have coagulation factors available to correct for specific factor deficiency. So correcting specific factor deficiency with FFP is generally not recommended. So FFP would generally be used where there are multiple factor deficiencies coexisting, like in liver disorders, and the patient has an ongoing bleed rather than just based on a lab value. A liver disease patient who has an ongoing bleed or is being taken up for procedure which may induce bleeding, those are conditions where you will plan an FFP transfusion. And a patient is taking vitamin K antagonist and you do not have time for medically reversing it. In that scenario, that is urgent reversal of anticoagulation by vitamin K antagonist, there you can give FFP. So these are mainly, in today's time, these are the main conditions where you will give FFP. Even DIC or massive hemorrhage. So as a part of the massive transfusion protocol, in addition to RBCs, you will of course give FFP. And also while the surgery is going on and you see a microvascular bleeding, you do not have time to wait for the lab values, PT, APTT and all that, but you suspect a bleed to be because of coagulation factor, coagulopathy, then you should give FFP to the patient. Lastly, deficiencies of single clotting factors for which we do not have factor concentrates available. In that case, you can think of giving FFP. The recommended therapeutic dose of FFP is 10 to 15 ml per kg body weight. Again, like I said, it is an abused product, so it is many a times ordered for correction of hypoalbuminemia, which is not recommended. It is not a substitute for albumin transfusions and should not be given. And it is not for nutritional purposes either, or for correction of immune deficiencies. Audits have time and again shown that these are some areas where FFP are quite often ordered, but should be avoided. The last product that we will be discussing about is cryoprecipitate. So cryoprecipitate is something which is again like red cell concentrate was a better version of whole blood. So cryoprecipitate is again a betterment of a fresh frozen plasma for some factors that we have to remember. It will not have all the factors present in FFP, but some of the factors would be present in a more concentrated form, like factor 8, von Willebrand factor, fibrinogen. All this mostly we give them for the cryo for the correction of these factors. So this is what is present in a concentrated form as far as cryoprecipitate is concerned, fibrinogen and factor 8. So it is present, it is prepared from fresh frozen plasma by thawing it at 4 degrees. Okay, we thaw it at 4 degrees, and again it is preserved at a frozen state. And the storage duration you should know is 1 year. All the frozen products, that is FFP and cryoprecipitate, have a duration of 1 year. You can keep it up to 1 year. What I skipped and what you should know is that platelets have a shelf life of only 5 days. So that is why, as far as ABO compatibility and all that is concerned, we cannot emphasize because there will be a huge problem as far as inventory management is concerned because of the 5-day shelf life of platelets. Talking about ABO compatibility of FFP, FFP should be ABO compatible, but RH system is not important as far as FFP is concerned. That you should keep in mind when you are ordering for FFP. Are A positive, A negative, like that positive, negative. The RH system is generally not important as far as FFP is concerned. And what are the most common indications of giving cryoprecipitate? It is generally used to correct fibrinogen problems, dysfibrinogenemia, DIC, okay, and wherever where the fibrinogen level is less than 1 gram per liter, you generally tend to correct it with cryoprecipitate. And these are some of the suggested transfusion rates in order to ensure that the transfusion is done within the stipulated period without compromising on the quality of the product, and the patient is also not harmed. Okay, so this slide clearly shows which is the what are the suggested transfusion rates for the pediatric and the adult patients, and for the maximum time limit which should be followed. So for the red cells it is 4 hours. This is absolutely essential to know, because once you spike the unit, the entire system is open. So there is always the risk of bacterial contamination, and we all know that red cells and blood is a good culture medium. So bacterial organisms will start proliferating, and the longer you take for transfusion, the higher is the risk of making it sepsis prone. So you want to avoid that, and you have to stick to the time limits for transfusion. So next what we will be discussing about is transfusion reactions. With this background, we know how to select a component, what is each of the component, like what is their storage temperature, should it be ABO compatible, or can we go across the group. With this background, we will next be discussing about transfusion reactions. So any untoward incident which happens, which can be directly correlated with transfusion, and we can say that there is a temporal relation between the transfusion and the occurrence of transfusion reaction, then we term it as transfusion reaction. Most of the times it is recommended that you should keep a proper gap as far as beginning a transfusion and beginning a new antibiotic is concerned. So you don't want any overlap of reactions and you getting confused whether it is a transfusion reaction or an ill effect of a drug. So that is why even pre-medications are generally not recommended before you start transfusion. There should be a proper gap. So the transfusion reactions can be divided into two groups: the immediate transfusion reaction and the delayed transfusion reaction. As far as clinically, that is more important. The reactions which happen immediately and the reactions which happen in a delayed manner. We need to know about this so that we have a high index of suspicion when a patient develops these symptoms. So what are the acute transfusion reactions? The acute transfusion reactions can be as mild as allergic reactions, or it can be as severe as sepsis, anaphylaxis. It could be acute hemolytic transfusion reactions, or circulatory overload or TRALI. So I will be covering each of these in a brief manner, because then otherwise it would just it is beyond the scope of this lecture. So mild allergic reaction, we all know, is just like an itching for the patient, a mild discomfort. He does not complain of anything else, just a mild itching, and it is generally taken care of quite easily. Anaphylaxis, we all know, is a much more severe reaction where it is even life threatening, and this is more often seen in patients who have IgA deficiency. We have learned this. IgA deficiency makes us prone to anaphylactic reactions. This is something which we cannot test in the laboratory, and hence it is crucial to monitor the patient, especially in the initial 15 to 20 minutes, because that is where you can pick up most of the life-threatening transfusion reactions. So you should be hawk-eyed and watching the transfusion in the patient in the first 15 minutes very, very carefully. So what is but most commonly seen are these allergic reactions and something which is called as febrile non-hemolytic transfusion reaction. What do we understand about febrile non-hemolytic transfusion reaction is, as the name says, it is not because of hemolysis, it is because of cytokines that is present in the blood. The cytokines are in turn released by the leukocytes, the WBCs. Okay, why is this understanding important? Suppose there is a patient like thalassemia or like a hematological malignancy patient who will require transfusion support time and again. So in that group of patient, you can avoid these febrile non-hemolytic transfusion reaction by leukoreduction, because you are removing the leukocytes and hence the product of leukocytes, that is cytokines. So you can avoid these FNHTRs as they are called by leukoreduction. So we should know about this specialized blood component, leukoreduced RBCs, which can be made available to such patients who are prone to developing FNHTR. One more obviously important transfusion reaction is septic transfusion reaction, and it can deceptively start as just a fever. So fever can never be taken casually. Even acute hemolytic transfusion reactions begin normally with a fever. So what is acute hemolytic transfusion reaction? It is, like the name suggests, there is lysis of the red cells that we are transfusing, or when we are transfusing plasma, there is lysis of the red cells present in the patient. So that is called a hemolytic transfusion reaction. Normally it is immune mediated, that means it is because of an antigen antibody mediated reaction where you have given an A blood group patient B blood group RBCs, like going across the group, or there is some gross mistake. That is normally the cause of acute hemolytic transfusion reaction. But one more very important cause is storage of red cells or subjecting it to very high temperature. So these extreme temperatures can also cause lysis of the red cells and can cause transfusion hemolytic transfusion reaction. So we need to be aware of that, and we should never attempt to either freeze it or store it in any temperature conditions which are not recommended by the government. So besides the blood bank refrigerator, red cells should not be stored anywhere else because of the risk of hemolytic transfusion reaction. Now one more thing that we should know is an immediate transfusion reaction is TACO and TRALI. TACO means transfusion associated circulatory overload, and TRALI is transfusion related acute lung injury. It would be too much to describe into detail each of these reactions. It would be good to look up about these. Okay, so TACO means obviously there has been an volume overload, and TRALI means there has occurred an immune reaction because of which there is injury to the lung. And I will briefly describe that the patient obviously will be dyspneic. So how do we distinguish between TRALI and TACO? The BP is generally high in TACO, transfusion associated cardiac overload, whereas it will be low in TRALI. BNP level, the brain natriuretic peptide levels, will be elevated in TACO, whereas in TRALI it will be low. And the response to diuretics is obviously better when it comes to TACO, whereas in TRALI you will not see much of a difference as far as the response to diuretics is concerned. And in TRALI there will be a transient leukopenia, which may or may not be appreciable, to be honest. So all the other things that I mentioned is more crucial as far as differentiating between TRALI and TACO is concerned. Both the set of patients may present with dyspnea, and it is worthwhile to distinguish between the two because the management would be different. Knowing about delayed transfusion reactions. So there are two groups of transfusion reactions which you should know. This is because this is not happening immediately post transfusion. So unless you have a high degree of suspicion, you will miss out on these. So you should know about this. There are two types of delayed transfusion reaction. One is delayed hemolytic transfusion reaction, and the other is transfusion associated GVHD, graft versus host disease. So delayed hemolytic transfusion reaction means it is again like acute only, but this is a delayed hemolytic transfusion reaction, and it is generally because of IgG type of antibodies. Okay, so it is not mainly because of ABO incompatibility, but incompatibility because of other blood group antigens. It is impossible to test for every antigen system as far as cross matching is concerned. So there can be such events where the patient will have hemolysis at a later stage. So you will see a patient who has been transfused, who was doing okay, but suddenly after say 10 to 14 days the hemoglobin level starts dipping, and you see features of hemolysis. So you should suspect a delayed hemolytic transfusion reaction. And one more thing which is absolutely crucial to know is transfusion associated graft versus host disease. So briefly I will say what happens is the lymphocytes of the donor, while we are transfusing blood, we are also transfusing lymphocytes inadvertently. So normally these lymphocytes which are transfused will not engraft in the host or the patient, because it is taken care of by the immune competent patient. But for some reason, if the patient himself is like severely immunocompromised, or one more important thing that we should remember as far as TA-GVHD is concerned is an HLA matching, that is first degree relative. So if the patient's first degree relatives like his parent or his sibling, we take blood from them and give, there would be partial HLA matching, and the lymphocytes which we are transfusing along with the product will go and engraft in the host, and that will be devastating, because these for hosts, this will take over the host's immune system, because these are foreign lymphocytes and they will attack the immune system of the patient, and there would be severe consequences where the liver, the skin, the bone marrow are the targets, and the fatality rate is very, very high as far as TA-GVHD is concerned. That is why we have a system in place where we do not collect directed donors, that is blood from any first degree relatives. We often get requests that we want our brother's blood to be transfused, or the our parents' blood to be transfused. So this is the reason why we avoid it, because of the risk of transfusion associated graft versus host disease. So with this background, I have tried to cover almost all the transfusion reactions. So we should be aware of each of these transfusion reactions. We should have a high index of suspicion, and at the same time we should be continuously monitoring the patient as far as transfusion is concerned, in order to identify these reactions, to stop the reaction, and also to report. An understanding of transfusion reaction is absolutely essential, not only in patient care but also for reporting, so that at the end of it all, like in 1 or 2 months, every 3 months say, if we have an audit to know how well the system is working, a proper reporting system has to be in place. So it has to be reported. As far as transfusion reaction is concerned, it does not suffice to just report to the treating physician. A transfusion reaction has to be reported to the blood bank as well, because we have to keep the records of the entire workup. How did the patient ultimately do? Did he recover? How did the transfusion reaction ultimately end, and was it because of any mistake from the blood bank, or what are the factors which actually contributed to the transfusion reaction? So all this is useful data which will help in improving the transfusion services, quality of the transfusion services. So reporting is essential. So how do we evaluate a patient? Now with this background, knowing what the transfusion reactions are, once we start transfusion, we have to keep looking for any discomfort in the patient, like dyspnea is important, any a variation in the vitals such as temperature, pulse, BP, all this is absolutely crucial as far as transfusion reaction goes, because though most of the febrile reactions are because of FNHTRs, that is febrile non-hemolytic transfusion reaction, it could also be a forebearer of some very severe conditions like hemolytic transfusion reactions, sepsis, and you don't want to take that risk and continue with the transfusion. So the golden rule is, as soon as you see signs and symptoms which are suggestive of a transfusion reaction, please stop the transfusion immediately, report to the physician, attending physician, and also report to the blood bank. And what more you need to do is send samples. You have to send the first voided sample of urine to the blood bank, and you have to collect blood from the opposite arm, not the same arm from which transfusion is going, but from the opposite arm, and the remaining volume of blood. The entire unit must have not gone before you notice a reaction, not always but most of the time. So whatever volume is remaining, please send it back to the blood bank. This is also crucial in the evaluation of transfusion reaction. So all these things are important. Is the patient developing fever? Is the patient developing dyspnea, hypotension, hypothermia? Hypothermia is generally not commonly seen when you are transfusing one RBC or 1 whole blood, generally hypothermia is not a problem. Hypothermia is more of importance in massive transfusions, where you are giving a huge volume of blood to the patient. There the temperature becomes important, because hypothermia, because you are transfusing such a huge volume of cold blood. So there is the risk of hypothermia. Otherwise, normally hypothermia is not a problem. So do not attempt to heat the blood just to make the patient comfortable, and studies say that it is more important to keep the patient warm rather than the bag warm. I have seen a practice where the nurses will try to cover the blood bag with lots of clothing to keep it warm, or to make it warm, but that is a concept which is not encouraged or understood. It is better to wrap the blanket on the patient rather than on the unit. So some common concepts and misconceptions: fresh blood, like fresh blood is better than old blood. Fresh blood, fresh blood is more important as far as neonatal transfusions are concerned, of very sick patients or CKD patients, where you are concerned about the electrolytes, because storage obviously leads to accumulation of potassium and other such biochemical changes in the blood. So there fresh blood is justified, but for each and every patient, expecting fresh blood to be given is not possible and not recommended as well. Warm blood, I already discussed. Warming of blood is not required for each and every unit, except in case of massive transfusion, where it has to be done in controlled conditions using a properly certified blood warmer. Not just any method, it has to be done by using a proper certified blood warmer. And one more thing that I have noticed here is, sometimes the entire adult dose of RDP is split. Please give us 3 RDPs, we will transfuse it now, and then we will give 3 RDPs later. That is not how it should generally be done. A single dose has to be given as a single dose. In case of antibiotics, do we try to split the dosage? The recommended dose is given as it is. We don't try to break and mess around with it. So same is the case with platelets or plasma or anything, any blood, the proper dosage has to be stuck to, and it has to be given as one dose. It cannot be just split for the sake of it. So what is the responsibility of the attending physician? The attending physician should thus, understanding all these factors, should assess, does the patient require transfusion? If the patient does require transfusion, when does he require? Planning the transfusion. Then making an order for the transfusion and recording. Recording is absolutely essential. The order should also be very, very clear with regards to which component is being ordered. Is it red cells? Is it platelet concentrate? Because we do see lots of requests where the patient, where they say that we need FFP. We thaw the unit, and then suddenly we are told that that was ordered for by mistake. And that leads to huge wastage of units, because we cannot reuse it or give it to some other patient, especially FFP and all. So you have to be absolutely careful as far as what is the order, which component are you ordering for, and it should be well documented so that there is no confusion at the end. One more important arena as far as transfusion is concerned is consent for transfusion. In today's age, we do not recommend blanket consents, that one single consent was taken and all the procedures can be done on the back of that consent. That is not how it goes. So specific to transfusion, what about the consent? So there are certain rights of the patient as far as consent regarding transfusion is concerned. The patient should be aware of the available alternatives like autologous transfusion. There are some situations where you can attempt autologous blood transfusion. So the patient should know that there is such a facility available, and then why are you recommending normal transfusion over autologous, and all the risks, the benefits. And like I already told you at the beginning, what we are testing for the TTI is by CMI, the chemiluminescence method. The best method is NAT. So all this the patient should know, because tomorrow if a medico-legal problem arises, the patient can always be said that he was informed about the inherent risk. So that is our duty. So it is also the right of the patient which should be honored. And We should also know that the patient has the right to refuse. Like there are groups of patients who may belong to the Jehovah's Witness, like because of religious reasons they can refuse transfusion. So we should we should be well informed if they are going to refuse and what are the alternatives and all. So these are the aspects of consent that we should know. And one more very important aspect of consent is it does not end with the transfusion. Suppose in future we come to know that the patient develops becomes transfusion transmissible infection positive, like HBsAg positive or HIV or HCV positive, it is our duty to inform them that it could be because of transfusion. How practical is it? I don't know, but that is what is recommended. Ethically, we should ideally be informing the patient. If some donor, like he comes after 6 months and he tests positive, he's a voluntary donor, and we come to know like 6 months back he had donated, and probably he was in the window period. So as doctors who are responsible for transfusion, it is our responsibility to inform the patient. What are planned transfusions and what do we need to do as far as planned transfusions are concerned? There is a huge confusion as far as transfusion request and ordering is concerned. Many a times we get requests where it is mentioned that it is an emergency, but even after the cross match is done for hours together, the report itself is not collected. So I do not know how to categorize that as an emergency. So an emergency should be an actual emergency, because we are following a triage system for the samples as well. They are generally done in small pools or batches, if you can call it that. So we are doing it in batches. So when you are doing it in batches, you need to give priority to the samples which have to be processed immediately. So when you are ordering for a transfusion request is being made, please be very clear about the category. Is it an emergency or is it a routine procedure? That is absolutely essential. So what are planned transfusions? Generally before surgery, there is severe anemia. You do not have time for correction of anemia by any other method like pharmacologically. The antenatal transfusions, where it can be done after maybe 1 week or 10 days. Planned surgeries and pre-transplants. These are areas where we can properly plan the transfusion for the patient before start going about it. So in this group of patients, what we should know is we should try to group and screen the patients. What do you mean by screening? Screening means we test the patient's sample for any irregular antibodies, any antibodies which is capable of causing a hemolytic, acute or delayed hemolytic transfusion reaction. We discussed it in the transfusion reaction section. So these transfusion reactions are because of these irregular antibodies, also known as alloantibodies. So all this screening and grouping all can be done in this group of patients, especially where we are doing it in a planned manner. The transfusion is planned. So we want to make it as safe as possible. We don't want anything bad happening to the patient who is otherwise okay. So in this group of patients, it's a good habit to send the sample in quite early for grouping and screening, and it also helps the blood banker to keep a proper inventory. The inventory management becomes easy. And like I mentioned, alloimmunization, if there are autoantibodies, all these problems can be identified early, especially in transplant patients and all, where if you just send it before the transplant, it could be disastrous, because then we identify an antibody which makes it impossible to get a compatible unit, and you will land up in trouble because you have made all the arrangements for the surgery and blood will not be available at the last minute. What is one most important is documentation. So the documentation aspect of transfusion starts right from the collection of sample, and it does not end with transfusion, rather it goes beyond the transfusion. Even after transfusion, you have to monitor the patient and write down the vitals and see that the transfusion was completely safe. So documentation is absolutely essential, and it should be meticulous so that there could be less error in the entire system. So a small brush up on what is the sampling requirements. For grouping, we need red cells also. So wherever you need red cells, even for DCT, you need red cells. Okay, so for these two things you need EDTA samples. So for DCT and for grouping, EDTA sample is required because you need red cells, and for cross matching and ICT you give a plain sample. So the red capped one. EDTA is for grouping and DCT, and the plain sample is for ICT and cross matching. That is how the selection of tube goes. Then the labeling of tube. The labeling, this is important, that the patient must have two identifiers. If the patient's name is Aisha B and what is her surname, that is absolutely essential. A single identifier will not be accepted. So the labeling has to be done in accordance with this system. The entire name has to be mentioned on the tube. And one more important thing as far as sampling is concerned is the volume is crucial. You cannot under collect or over collect because there is a like a ratio of the EDTA and blood. So all that has to be honored and done accordingly, so that it is a good sample which comes to the transfusion laboratory. And also one more important thing is the signature of the phlebotomist is crucial. So more than fearing the system and thinking that this would be a punitive one, it would more like, you know, it would be encouraging to think that we can identify the errors if at all it occurs and take proper corrective action. Nobody will be punished. So that fear should not stop us from adhering to the rules. We should put up the sign of the phlebotomist. So the selection of the tube, the labeling, and one more important aspect is never pre-label the tube. The tube should always be labeled at the bedside right at the time of collection. Like 5 or 6 tubes together, you group label it, and then you take it up for collection, and that is chaos, and it could always lead to a mix up. And generally what we should understand is errors occur in pairs. Single errors generally don't occur as far as sampling are concerned. Generally it will occur in pair, and it will lead to many problems. So it is best to avoid pre-labeling of the tube, and it has to be done at the bedside. Talk to the patient, not just based on what is written on the file. Talk to the patient, confirm the identity of the patient. If the patient is not conscious, then the patient's bystander should be approached. The identity has to be confirmed before sampling. I am putting emphasis here because there is a study in UK, SHORT, Serious Hazards of Transfusion. So the SHORT has shown that maximum problems arise because of these sampling and labeling errors more than anything else. More than transfusion, more than testing problems or any other problems, it is the labeling which is most crucial, and clerical errors are responsible for most of the transfusion reactions. So we should try to minimize them. Request requirements. Audit of requests in the blood bank will definitely give you a clear picture of the fact that it is never completely filled. Most of the transfusion requests that come to us are not completely filled, do not have lab values, even the indication for transfusion is not properly written. So please try to ensure that each of these values and everything that is required has been filled in the request form. This is because again it will be subject to audit. Timely audits will be done in order to evaluate, so that we can improve the quality of the service being provided, and we can also identify knowledge gaps in the people who are directly concerned with transfusion ordering. So all this can be done only if all the necessary information has been provided to the blood bank. Otherwise it's a wasteful exercise. So this slide shows what is the mandatory information that has to be sent to the blood bank as far as a transfusion request is concerned. So the age, the gender, the registration number, like I said, the name of the patient should be 2 identifiers. The type of requisition, this is absolutely crucial for our institute, I would say. Is it a routine, an urgent, and immediate? Immediate means you do not have time to stop, the patient is exsanguinated and you have to transfuse at any cost. So out of immediate you have to tick, but for routine procedures please do not tick it as emergency and create a confusion as far as how to process the sample is concerned, because we have data only as far as what you are ticking and sending us. Also crucial is transfusion history, pregnancy history, medication history, because all this can lead to a positive ICT incompatibility as far as transfusion testing is concerned. So that is why pre-transfusion compatibility testing will be interfered if there are some allo antibodies or auto antibodies secondary to medication. That is why all this history is important, and it must be included in the request forms as far as possible. And the NABH clearly states that if there is a sample which is not meeting the proper requirements, the sample is not to be given back into the ward for correction. That is not allowed. The sample must be discarded in the blood bank itself, because there is a risk of couple error. Like I said, generally errors occur in pairs. So if I give back the sample and you correct it, like who is actually responsible at the end of this debacle? So it has to be, the practice should be such that if there is any problem as far as the sample is concerned, it has to be discarded in the blood bank and a fresh sample must be sent. So here onwards, now that everybody has been made aware of these facts, that is how the blood bank will be functioning. The sample must strictly meet all the requisition criteria, and if it doesn't meet the required standards, it will be discarded and a fresh sample will be asked for. And one more, like the whole thing, it has to be documented. Everything has to be documented, the vitals, and what do we record as far as transfusion is concerned. While you are transfusing the patient, you will start with a checklist. A checklist has now been provided at the bedside. The entire checklist must be gone through. 2 people must be involved in checking and rechecking. The label is correct, is the product correct, is it meant for this patient itself, and then you start with the transfusion. And before starting the transfusion, the vitals have to be recorded. I have already mentioned that pre-medications should generally be avoided because it may mask a serious transfusion reaction. A fever may not become obvious because you have pre-medicated the patient, and it could be like a sign of something more serious, which if you miss out will have drastic consequences. So avoid transfusion medications on a routine basis unless it is absolutely necessary. The label and all that. So the vitals have to be recorded, and the first 15 minutes have to be absolutely seriously watched, and even after that every 1 hour you should record the vitals. So first 15 minutes, then 30 minutes, then hourly you should record the vitals. And there is something called as feedback which is sent with each of the components that has to be filled. The vitals of the patient through the course of the transfusion is recorded and sent back to the blood bank. So in future, if somebody claims to have had a transfusion reaction, we can always go back retrospectively, and it also helps in audits. So it has to be filled and sent back to the transfusion department. So in a nutshell, we covered almost, I think, everything with from beginning with the components, understanding the components, the situations where the components should be ordered, their optimal storage temperature, should we stick to ABO group or we can go across the group or not, the specific situations where the components are required, how do we sample, how do we send it for a transfusion request, what is documentation, what about the consent of the patient, and even the various transfusion reactions starting with the immediate and the delayed as well, and how to identify these. So this is what I have tried my best to cover, almost everything, and you will also be given written material explaining all this. So I hope that you will find the time to go through that, and in case of any difficulties or confusion, you can always call me. Thank you.